thank you all for joining us on our new adventure here. We're still learning how to do this. And yeah, it's a little bit different than meeting in person like we have before, but I just want to send you guys all a warm welcome. If you want to get the lecture notes and the recipes for tonight's program, you can email me at reversingdiabetes@yahoo.com. I think that's an easy address to remember, just reversingdiabetes@yahoo.com. And I will send you the attachment for the recipes and lecture notes tonight. And as we usually do, on Wellness Wednesdays, we get together, learn health information, and nobody's perfect on this. And this is why we love to have the class repeated every year. So we can kind of get a jump start, reboot up, and, kind of rev up our goals and get back into good eating and walking and all those fun things too. And it's nice to do it as a group. And I just, so nice to have you join us. And I just want to give a little disclaimer to start with, and I know Maria does this too, but we're just a health education program, just general information. It's not, we're not taking the place of your physician, and everything that you do here, if you want to apply it, we do suggest that you speak with your healthcare provider, because when this program does work, sometimes you need some adjusting to your medications to lower so that you don't get sick and faint and drop down. But other than that, yeah, this is good information for everybody. And in addition to diabetes and reversing type 2 diabetes, and Maria's going to explain this so much better and nicely, that it's good for so many endocrine and other issues. So this is great. I should probably introduce Maria to, I just assume everybody knows Maria. Maria has done this class for us. Is this our 8th? I think this might be our 8th time that we've run this class, that Maria's presented this to us. And she does all her wonderful research, and her organizes her PowerPoints. And she's written some books, and I know she's going to talk about those. She also, Zoom has provided a platform for her that she doesn't have to actually travel to other countries like she used to. She can do it right from home, but she's in demand. And so we are so thankful and grateful that she's donating her time and her beautiful work for us that she's created. And someday she'll tell more about herself, but she has a bachelor's in computer engineering. I know it's engineering. Yeah. And then she has a master's in nutrition and a master's in public health. She's working on her doctorate. And then you have a certificate in lifestyle medicine. I always mess that up.
Yes, correct.
Okay. And yeah, I know you're working on your doctorate. So, and she's a mom and a wife and a dear friend. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, and feel free to add anything that I left out. So,
thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope you are able to see it. If you're not,
yes.
No, great. And well, just want to thank Tricia again for inviting me to be part of this. I am very excited to do a different format. Of course, I do like doing the regular format too, but this is going to be a new adventure. We're going to learn a lot of things together, I think. And yes, we've been doing this class for a few years, and there's new information, new emerging research all the time. And in fact, right now I'm taking a class, a continuing education class from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine on reversing diabetes. It's pretty extensive class, so I'm learning, and as I'm learning, I will be sharing with you some of the things that I've been learning through this class, because it's all, you know, very new research on the different aspects of reversing diabetes. But the good news is that this is becoming so mainstream that it's being taught to physicians and other healthcare practitioners, which is great news. And like Tricia said, I would like to give a little disclaimer. This is not intended to be any type of treatment, as you might probably expect. This is all educational. And so if you do have diabetes, pre-diabetes, or insulin resistance, or any other health conditions, you really want to work with your physician. Hopefully, we will have more physicians that are, you know, certified by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine in our area. I know there's a couple in the Santa Cruz area. There's not a lot yet, but this is a growing branch of medicine. So hopefully we'll have more physicians that are very well acquainted with this kind of information so that they can work with patients to really help them to reverse diabetes. Diabetes is reversible, and we'll learn more about that during this series of programs. I just want to give you a little bit more on my background. I did work for Salud para la Gente, which is right there in Watsonville, California. This is a picture from when I used to work there. Now it's been remodeled with all the money they got from the federal government. It looks great. It looks bigger. But I did work as a nutritionist there for quite a few years, and I worked mostly with diabetics. I worked with a lot of gestational diabetes patients, as well as type 2 diabetes patients, and other healthcare conditions that are very much related to diabetes. And we'll actually find out more about that today, that hypertension and hyperlipidemia, such as high cholesterol or high triglycerides, these are all dysregulations in the metabolism, really, of lipids and glucose, and they're very well related. So we'll find out more about that. Here's a picture of one of our first programs I think we did right there in the Watsonville church quite a few years ago. So we always have a good turnout because it seems like people are indeed interested in how to improve their health. And lifestyle medicine is in fact pretty much the only way to reverse diabetes and to improve health in all aspects, which is different from other things that you could hear sometimes in popular media, or even like the fad diets, that they might help in one thing. They might help you reduce your glucose, but then they can cause a lot of damage in other aspects. I also like to mention that I did go to Honduras a few years ago. I think it was 7 years ago now, with Dr. Milton Teskey and a few other people. We went on a missionary trip to Honduras, and we did a reverse diabetes program in a very small little village in the middle of nowhere in rural Honduras. And I was surprised to find out that people in rural Honduras do have diabetes. In fact, they have diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, all the same lifestyle conditions we see in our modern, you know, westernized society. And yet I thought, well, there's no way people in rural Honduras will have the same diseases, but yes, they do. And in fact, here's a picture of us teaching some of the ladies there in the village how to exercise, maybe for the first time in their lives. Yeah, they have a lot of junk food, unfortunately, available to them. Even though there's no grocery stores in this little village, there's not even a paved road in this little village. Yet you go to the little stores that are in like the corners there, this like very tiny place, and you go into the stores and you see junk food. So junk food has been exported to practically every country on the planet, unfortunately, and we're all suffering from the same types of food-related diseases. Here's a picture of us feeding them. We actually gave them a lot of vegetables, a lot of plant-based foods, very healthy, high in fiber, and they weren't necessarily used to eating this way, but they enjoyed themselves quite a bit. Here's a lady from the Fresno Adventist Church who was a nutritionist as well. She did the food demos, and she asked me before the trip, hey, do you have some cookbooks that you can take, because I need to figure out what to cook over there. And I'm like, sure, I'll take my cookbooks. And I took a stack of cookbooks. She did too. When we got there, we realized they were going to be of no use whatsoever, because there's, like I said, no grocery store, there's no Whole Foods, there's no Staff of Life, there's nothing like that at all. And in fact, they didn't even have electricity in this place where we stayed for 10 days. Now they have, I've been going back to that place and I've gone back a few times. They have some electricity now, but the first year we went, there was no electricity. All the food was kept in a dark room with no refrigeration at all in the middle of tropical Honduras. So bottom line is that she had to make food from scratch, new recipes, just based on what they had. And what they had beans, they had corn, they had a lot of vegetables, they had fruit, they have some brown rice that they had to go to the capital city to get, and they had other things like that. And she just made up new recipes based on these foods they had. And the bottom line, I think the good lesson maybe for us is that we don't have to buy fancy food to be healthy. We can buy very affordable, basic foods and transform our health through doing that. And we'll learn that through this series of programs. But the bottom line is this. Research, and I mean medical, nutritional research, has shown without a doubt that pre-diabetes is completely reversible, and type 2 diabetes is reversible in most cases. And in fact, as part of the new information that I'm going to give you in this iteration of this program, is that here's a paper actually was I think published in 2009, and it's basically a position paper, a statement from the American Diabetes Association. And it's amazing to me that the title is, how do we define cure? Let me just repeat that word, cure. Doctors and even nutritionists and dietitians don't like that word very much. They don't like to say that diabetes can be cured, but yet the evidence of this is irrefutable. You can't escape the fact that people are in fact curing their diabetes through lifestyle. And so here they are defining the parameters of how do we say, okay, in her case, it was actually cured. And it has to do with your A1C levels or glucose levels. If you reach a pre-diabetes level, at least for a year, you can be considered at least somewhat cured. But if you reach below a pre-diabetes level, like normal glucose level, and it lasts at least a year, you are considered cured. It's complete remission of diabetes. So this is now part of the evidence that has been published in research literature, and we can be confident that this in fact is possible. And so I just wanted to mention that, because even when I worked at Salud para la Gente many years ago, I did a diabetes class with a group of patients. And during the first lesson, one of the doctors was there. She wanted to be there because some of her patients were going to be there. And she wanted to give an introduction and talk about the medical aspects of diabetes. And so she gave the first lesson of this series of classes we did at the clinic. And she stood up, she welcomed everybody. And one of the very first things she said was this. She said, by the way, you all, she said, welcome, thank you for coming to this class, blah, blah, blah. And then she said, if you have type 2 diabetes, let me just let you know that type 2, you will have this disease forever. This disease cannot be cured. You will have it for the rest of your life. That was the first thing she said. Medical doctor, Salud para la Gente. I'm not exactly sure what year that was, but I was there. I saw it and heard it. And of course, I was, taken back a little, but I didn't say anything out of respect for her. I did, clarify, so to speak, to the group in the next lesson when I was by myself there talking about the nutritional aspects of diabetes, that in fact, research has shown that it is reversible. The second thing she said was, if you're not using insulin yet, you will, because all diabetics eventually have to use insulin. So that was another thing that also took me back, because I know that is not the case. Maybe that's what doctors were taught at some point, but it's not the case anymore. And I hope more and more doctors are able to update their knowledge on this topic. Now, the other thing I just want to mention briefly, type 2 diabetes is not the only type of diabetes, as you probably have heard many times. Type 1 diabetes is a smaller percentage, much smaller percentage, maybe about 5% of the cases of diabetes are type 1. And as you probably know, in fact, it used to be called juvenile diabetes because it used to be diagnosed in youth, whereas type 2 used to be diagnosed in middle age or even older. And now those terms aren't used anymore because type 2, which used to be called adult onset diabetes, is now diagnosed in youth, younger people, so often that that term just doesn't apply anymore, unfortunately. But type 1, yeah, used to be called juvenile diabetes, is an autoimmune type of diabetes in the sense that there's an autoimmune reaction in your pancreas which destroys the cells that produce insulin. So type 1 people have to use insulin for the rest of their life. That is true. However, it has been found that people who have type 1 also develop the condition that we will be discussing today, which is the root cause of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. So people with type 1 can also benefit from the lifestyle things we will be talking about that will help to reverse type 2, because it will help to bring down that their use of insulin, their need for insulin. Type 1.5, I don't know if you've ever heard of this before. It's also called LADA because it's a latent type of diabetes, which is an autoimmune type of diabetes. Latent in the sense that it usually develops in the adult life. It is also an autoimmune. So it's kind of like a mixture between type 1 and type 2 in the sense that it's an autoimmune diabetes, but it usually is diagnosed later in life. And it's a slower to progress type of diabetes as opposed to type 1, which usually progresses very fast. So, so both type 1 and 1.5 will definitely benefit from the information we will be sharing. Type 3, have you ever even heard of this? Type 3 diabetes? You know what type 3 diabetes is? It's Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is now considered type 3 diabetes because actually the same metabolic process that happened in the body that caused diabetes that we will talk about today happened in the brain as well. And it is probably one of the causes of Alzheimer's disease. So just FYI to let you know, people, it's good to know this information because it will also help you to hopefully avoid Alzheimer's disease. Now, I used to work with gestational diabetes a lot, so I know the same foundational principles that apply to type 2 apply to gestational diabetes. So I just wanted to let you know, just cover those. Like I said, in type 2 diabetes is over 90% of the cases of diabetes are type 2. So that is the one type of diabetes we will concentrate on the most. Okay, having said that, why isn't it more widely known that you can reverse diabetes? It's getting there. Like I said in the beginning, it is becoming more mainstream, but it's not 100% mainstream yet. A lot of people have not heard of the concept of reversing diabetes, so that's even possible. And here are some of the reasons why I think that it's not 100% mainstream yet or widely known as it should. Number one is that scientific research trickles down slowly into medical practice. So there's doctors who are practicing today who were educated 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago who did not learn the principles that we are going to learn about today. And doctors are very busy people. They have to be reading a lot of medical journals and getting continuing education all the time to update their knowledge. But it's difficult. It's difficult to know everything that's out there. So it is slow to trickle down when we have new research like this, so we're going to talk about today. Many doctors think that patients would not follow the advice to change their lifestyle. And this might be very well true in some respects. Some people do prefer to get the pill as opposed to having to exercise or change their diet. Plus, it takes a long time to explain everything that is involved in changing someone's lifestyle. Of course, we will have several sessions to explain all of that to you. Doctors usually don't have that kind of time, and they're pressed for time. As you know, medicine is a business nowadays, you probably know. Medical journals, unfortunately, sometimes are dominated by pharmaceutical industry sponsored studies. So all of this lifestyle type of thing doesn't always make it to the main medical journals because sometimes, unfortunately, there's some conflicting, financial interests there. That's very unfortunate, but that is the truth. Okay, let's talk about prediabetes real quick. This is an epidemic, the one that we don't talk about as much as we talk about the other epidemic or pandemic we have right now. But really, prediabetes is an epidemic. In fact, look at just the figures right here. They come from a book by Dr. Wes Youngberg. The name of the book is Hello Healthy. That's where he presents these statistics. Half of the adults between ages of 40 and 59 have prediabetes, whether they know it or not. Most of these people are not diagnosed because they haven't checked. 2/3 of adults between the ages of 60 and 74. And by the age of 74 or older, 3/4 of adults are probably pre-diabetic, whether they know it or not. So it is really, this affects, what I'm going to talk about, really affects the majority of adults, if you think about it. The other really sad part about this whole story is the statistics in children. So this really relates to children, especially born after the year 2000. And in the general population, it is expected that 1 out of every 3 children will be diagnosed with diabetes if things don't change. In other words, if we continue to eat the foods we eat, if we continue the lifestyle we have, if we continue to promote the kinds of food that keep being promoted in our society, and children basically are eating them. And in other words, if things don't change in the next decades, 1 of every 3 children who were born after the year 2000, some of them are young adults today, will be a diabetic. And that's in the general population. Among Hispanics and African Americans, the statistics are a lot worse. In fact, 1 of every 2. Half of these children will be diabetic. Whether it is early on, with this in their 20s, 30s, 40s, we don't know that. Some of them are being diagnosed as we speak. As when I was a nutritionist at Salud para la Gente, I saw children as young as 12 diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So unfortunately, that is the big problem right now. Okay, so what is diabetes? Let's talk about that a little bit. Every time I ask this question in front of an audience, people give me a few different things that are true, really, that are, in one way or another are true, but there's also a little bit of confusion. So some of the people that, when they answer this question, some people say it's lack of insulin. So something is wrong in the body is not producing enough insulin. So blood glucose goes up or blood sugars go up. And other people don't talk about insulin, they talk about the sugar part. It's when you have a lot of sugar in your blood. That's true also. So since there's some misconceptions that really as to what really is diabetes, we're going to talk about that today. That's going to be the theme today. What is diabetes? How does it happen? What is the root cause, especially of type 2 diabetes? Because type 1 and 1.5 are autoimmune diseases, which is a whole different, aspect of lifestyle medicine today. We are addressing, within the field of lifestyle medicine, we are addressing autoimmune disease and more, and realizing some of these diseases are preventable. In fact, some, not all, but some are reversible. So I'm not sure that type 1 would count, or type 1 or type 1.5, but in some ways they could be preventable if we start lifestyle interventions early on in someone's life. But we'll talk about type 2. What is type 2? Well, first of all, let's start with very general information about our metabolism of foods we eat. So when we eat whatever food, today I had sweet potato with lentils, some salad, that was my lunch. A lot of that food, of course, has carbohydrates. These carbohydrates from most of the foods we consume are then, absorbed and metabolized into smaller particles, smaller molecules of sugar, of carbohydrates, of simple sugars. And the main one in the body is called glucose. Glucose is the main sugar that actually feeds our cells. So it's very important. Sometimes I ask the question, is glucose bad? Is it a bad thing to have glucose in your blood? Well, no. If you didn't have glucose in your blood, you would probably die. You do need glucose. Glucose is very important. The problem is when we have too much of it, but we'll talk about that. But basically, glucose needs to go into our cells, especially our muscle cells, so that we can move every day. But really, every cell of the body needs to be fed with glucose. So it needs to enter the cell somehow. And that's where insulin plays a role, because glucose have these receptors. You can think of them as doors. And here I use a little illustration to make things easy and simple to understand. These receptors are a type of door that needs to be opened in order for glucose to go in and do its job, which is to feed these little furnaces right here. Do you see these little furnaces right here? There's 3 of them in this illustration. It's mitochondria. They're little organelles inside of the cell, which produce energy. We need that energy to survive. So the job of insulin is basically to open the door and let the glucose inside the cell. That is the job of insulin. Now, some things sometimes go wrong with this little story. Sometimes the insulin is not able to open the door. There's things that interfere with its ability to open the door. So in very general terms, unfortunately, sometimes with diabetes, what happens is that these doors cannot be opened, and therefore the glucose does not go inside the cell as it should. And if it doesn't go inside the cell, what happens is that the glucose then accumulates in the blood. And you go and check your blood in the morning, and sure enough, it's on 150, 170, 200. It's basically an excess of sugar in the blood because it's not able to go in where it should go, which is inside the cell. In the pancreas, unfortunately, sensing this excess of sugar in the blood basically tries to solve the problem by pumping out more insulin, thinking, well, maybe the problem is that I'm not producing enough. Let's try pumping out more of these guys. And there's more of these guys out here, but the doors are blocked. And that's why they're not opening. And let me explain to you why it happens that these doors are blocked. There's something inside the cell. There's this little, you can almost say like little particles of fat. Intramyocellular lipid is the technical name for fat that accumulates inside cells, liver cells, muscle cells, even pancreatic cells accumulate excess fat. And why does this happen? Because we either consume too many calories, too much fat, and exercise too little. So what happens is when we accumulate too many calories and too much fat in our diet, this fat goes inside the cell. And it does not need insulin to go inside the cell. It is much easier for fat to go inside the cell than sugar to go inside the cell, because fat does not require any help, anybody to open the door. It just goes right in. Whereas glucose needs someone to open the door. So it needs an extra step, an extra help. Fat accumulates much easier in muscle cells and liver cells and pancreatic cells than sugar. And this situation happens especially when we consume a high-fat diet, but even excess calories can become fat. As you probably know, right? If we consume too many calories, whether they're from sugar, protein, some fats, they become fat because fat is a storage type of tissue. Fat is the way we store additional energy in the body. So when we have too many calories or too much fat, it's like we're storing too much energy inside the cell. So it's almost like when you put too much food into your pantry and you cannot fit any more food into your pantry. Like the cell is almost like a pantry that says, hey, you're putting too much stuff in here. You cannot fit anything else anymore. So as a response of it being full, it closes the door of the pantry and locks it up so that you cannot put any more stuff in. It's kind of like that if you can think of it in those terms, right? So there's too much energy in the cell in the form of fat. These fat globules, this intramyocellular lipid that is stored inside the cell, interferes with insulin's actions. So it does not allow insulin to open the door, so to speak, and bring in the glucose. And when that happens, then glucose accumulates in the blood, and you go test your sugar in the morning or after eating, and it's above the threshold for diabetes. That is called, and let me give you this very important name right now. This is the root cause of diabetes. And it is called insulin resistance. Let me just repeat that because this is the most important point I will make all night. This situation is called insulin resistance. Insulin resistance happens when there's excess energy inside of cells and is not being used up. That's why I also mentioned exercise briefly. It's a problem of excess calories, in particular excess fat, and lack of exercise. Because when you exercise, you're using up energy. The energy is produced in these little furnaces that I mentioned called mitochondria. So the more energy you burn, let's say you go on a 10-mile run, will you be using quite a bit of energy? Yes, you will. So therefore, that energy that had been accumulated inside of the cell will be burned up. And so when we accumulate too much energy and don't burn it up, we're putting too much food in the pantry. The pantry says, stop. Do not put any more stuff in me because I am full. And that is basically insulin resistance. If you think about it in terms of the cell being too full of energy and saying, stop, do not bring any more energy. Glucose is energy. I don't need it anymore. There's too much. Please don't do that. Stop. That is insulin resistance. It is the root cause of type 2 diabetes. And that's why we end up with excessive blood glucose as opposed to normal glucose. It's also the root cause of prediabetes. This situation does not happen overnight. It is a process that could take years to develop. And let me tell you, type 1 diabetics can also develop insulin resistance. Even though the root cause of type 1 diabetes is not insulin resistance, they can also develop it if they consume a high-fat diet, if they consume too many calories, if they don't exercise, if their lifestyle allows for insulin resistance to occur. And what happens when a person with type 1 diabetes starts to develop insulin resistance, they will need greater and greater amounts of insulin to control their blood glucose. So you might have heard situations where people with type 1 also need more insulin. And type 1.5 is very similar. People with 1.5 diabetes, latent diabetes, as we called it, can also develop insulin resistance. So let me show you the stages of how this happens. This is also from Dr. Wes Youngberg. This is from his book, Goodbye Diabetes. And it's fascinating to me because he actually developed this when he was down in Guam, helping the government there to try to reverse some of the high rates of diabetes in Guam. You might not know this. Guam is, of course, a territory of the United States. If it was a country on its own, it would probably have the highest or one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And so the authorities in Guam invited Dr. Wes Youngberg to come down to Guam and help, bring down those diabetes rates. And as he was able to observe some of the people there with diabetes and how they started to develop some complications of high blood sugar before they were even diagnosed with diabetes. In fact, sometimes before they were even diagnosed with pre-diabetes. Let me repeat that. sometimes people start to develop complications of diabetes before they're diagnosed with either diabetes or prediabetes. This is where the 5 stages of blood glucose comes in. So as you can see, if you take your blood sugar fasting, and it comes up as 126 or more, you probably have to repeat this a few times to confirm, right? And you know, a doctor would probably take your A1C nowadays, but this is just for illustrations. If your blood sugar is above 126 consistently, you are a diabetic, fasting blood sugar. If you're above 100, you are probably pre-diabetic. And Dr. Wes Youngberg divides it in 2 stages. You have pre-diabetes and advanced prediabetes, because really, what is the difference between 125 and 126? It's just the number they picked, right? So advanced prediabetes is almost the same as diabetes, but you see how the process begins. It doesn't just happen overnight. But even if you go to the doctor tomorrow morning and you take your fasting blood sugar and it comes up as 90, what will most doctors or healthcare practitioners say about your blood sugar being 90 fasting? They would probably say, great, your blood sugar is perfectly normal. Bravo, go home, you can be fine. You don't have to worry about a thing. Well, Dr. Youngberg would disagree with that, because he says he saw people with quote unquote normal sugars that were already developing some complications of high blood sugar. So he came up with these other 2 stages. Stage 1, high blood sugar. Stage 2 of high blood sugar. And so anything above 85 really starts to show that sugars are a little bit too high. There's something going on, because ideally fasting blood sugars should be around 70 to 84. Once you go above 85, it's not ideal anymore. Something is going on. What do you think is going on? There's already some insulin resistance. You see, once there's insulin resistance, blood sugar is not the only problem that's going on there. There's many other things that are associated with this root cause of diabetes, because insulin resistance is a metabolic problem that affects other parts of the body. If you're eating too much fat, if you're not doing enough exercise, if we're eating too many calories, it's affecting more than just blood sugar, as we will see. But right here in the 85 to 99 range, you have not been diagnosed with anything, but you might have some of the complications, you see. So right here, there's already some insulin resistance going on, even before you're pre-diabetic. So that's why it's so important to understand the concept of insulin resistance. And I just saw Dr. Wes Youngberg give a lecture for the lifestyle medicine, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. He presented this new table here. It's a little bit expanded. It shows the A1C levels for all the stages. There's 4 more stages of diabetes he added on here, as you can see, or 5 more stages he added on. And so this is all about advanced diabetes. So in other words, once your fasting blood sugars are above 140, you have pretty serious advanced diabetes, severe diabetes if it's above 200. If you have above 300 fasting blood sugar or 12.6 A1C level, you have a very critical problem and you need to address it immediately. This is dangerous. This is really, really dangerous. But all of it right here is really dangerous, really. So here, as you see, there's increased risk of heart disease, even with before prediabetes. Before prediabetes, there's already increased risk of heart disease. That's what he started noticing even before prediabetes. Of course, after prediabetes, once you're a pre-diabetic, of course, there's a 50% more chance you will have a heart attack. And in fact, you can see it right here. Heart attack risk starts to increase slightly with before pre-diabetes, but with elevated blood sugar. And of course, as a pre-diabetic, there's definitely an increase of heart attacks right here. once you become a diabetic, the risk goes up dramatically. If you're in this critical stages, over 250% increase. So that's what we see. It's very interesting. So let's talk about the other aspects of insulin resistance. So like I said, insulin resistance does not just affect blood glucose levels. Here's all the other things that happens when there's insulin resistance in the body. It causes high blood pressure. It promotes low good cholesterol. As you know, good cholesterol, HDL, we want more of it. You know, the reason why we want more of it is because bad cholesterol, it's almost like if you were putting, if I always think of a church because I do a lot of presentations of in churches. So I think of an aisle in a church. And if you think of bad cholesterol, it's like dirt you put on you like dump on the floor, and it's really bad. It needs to be taken out. And the more dirt there is, it's almost like you need more people taking it out. Well, the HDL, it's almost like a broom that sweeps out the dirt on the floor. The more dirt, the more brooms you need. So if you have higher LDL, which by the way, insulin resistance causes higher LDL levels, the higher the LDL, the higher the HDL you will need. Some people, when they change their diet and their lifestyle, their HDL comes down and they get worried. And that only needs to be a problem if your LDL stays high. If your LDL is lowered and your total cholesterol comes down, then it's not that much of a problem if your HDL also comes down, because you don't need that many brooms to sweep all that dirt. You see what I'm saying? Anyway, insulin resistance brings down the amount of good cholesterol, increases triglycerides, increases LDL, the bad cholesterol, causes up and down sugar levels, so that, you know, hypoglycemia, sometimes people suffer from, is the exact same cause, is the exact same root cause of high blood sugars, diabetes, hyperglycemia, and hypoglycemia, the low blood sugar levels some people suffer from. Same root cause, insulin resistance. And as we said, increases risk for heart attacks, but also strokes, Alzheimer's. Remember type 3 diabetes, Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease is insulin resistance in the brain. This has been shown, especially in the last few decades, because since we invented PET scans, basically, we're able to take images of the brain. We started noticing the different aspects of glucose metabolism in the brain. And once we were able to have that technology, we realized there can also be insulin resistance of the brain. And it's very much related to Alzheimer's, the development of Alzheimer's disease. Also, many types of cancer are related to insulin resistance. So the bottom line I'm trying to convey this evening is that insulin resistance is a real huge problem. It is the root cause of prediabetes and diabetes. It complicates type 1 and 1.5 diabetes. It really makes a big mess of our metabolism. So it also brings about other metabolic problems such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, and all these other things we talked about. So what we need to address, more than the symptom of diabetes, the symptom of diabetes is high blood glucose, but it's not the disease. The disease is a metabolic condition that underlies that high blood glucose level, and the disease is insulin resistance. If we focus on addressing the root cause of diabetes, then it is much more likely and possible that we can reverse the problem. It might not be possible in everybody, but research has shown that up to 90% of people with type 2 diabetes can reverse it. It's not 100%, but it's way above 80, 85. Some research has shown about 84%. Some research has shown up to 90%. So it is reversible in the vast majority of cases, not 100%, but in a great percentage of cases. So let's talk about the risk factors that lead then to insulin resistance and diabetes. Number one, excessive storage of energy, whether it is in the muscle cells or adipose cells, which are fat cells. All of this extra fat not only accumulates in the muscle cells and fat cells, it also accumulates in the liver cells and in the pancreatic cells. And this can cause lipotoxicity of the pancreas, which can kill then those pancreatic cells that produce insulin. So if this situation is not addressed properly at some point in the disease, it will eventually lead to destruction of pancreatic cells that produce insulin, the beta cells in the pancreas. So a person with type 1 can indeed someday need insulin forever if those pancreatic cells are destroyed because of excess fat in the body, excess fat. Now, some people, unfortunately, could be obese and not know it. What? How's that possible? If you're obese, you would be able to tell, wouldn't you? Don't you think? I mean, it's pretty visible. Well, let me tell you about what I call the fat skinny syndrome. Here it is. As you can see, here's a lady who started off overweight and lost weight. But there's two different choices. You can lose weight the healthy way or the unhealthy way. If you lose weight the healthy way, that means you eat healthy and exercise, you will have a healthy amount of muscle and reduce fat because that's what you want, don't you? If you have excess fat, don't you want to burn the excess fat, or do you want to burn your muscle? Do you want to get rid of your muscle and water, or do you want to get rid of the fat? You probably want to get rid of the fat. Well, what happens is when we go on a crash diet and lose the weight and not exercise, we will not get rid of the fat. We will probably get rid of the water and some of the muscle mass, especially if we lose weight too fast and not exercise. And you can have excess fat and be skinny or normal weight. You see what I'm saying? So I call it the skinny fat syndrome because some people indeed have normal BMI. So you go to the doctor, they take your weight, they take your height. Oh, great, you have normal BMI, no problem. The problem is a scale does not measure body fat. Some people have excess fat. Regardless of the weight, they have excess fat, and that is the problem. So more important than weight is the amount of fat in our body. How do you know if you have excess fat, by the way? Because, you can go to a university and they have these very fancy medical centers where they dip you in water and they take measure your blood, your body fat percentage in a very accurate way. Or you can go to maybe a gym. Well, now they're closed, I think, most of them. But if you go to a gym, they usually have some special instruments where they pinch your fat and, different parts of the body, and they make a calculation. They pretty much tell you, there's some scales that are not super accurate that can do it kind of, but here's the way to know it. It's free. It's available for everybody. You don't have to pay any money. You want to know what it is? It's free. Trisha knows, she's smiling. I think she knows what I'm going to say. It's called the mirror test. The mirror test, says Teresa. Teresa looked up like, what? What is that? The mirror test is this. You stand in front of a mirror with just your underwear. It will be visible. Let me tell you. Let me just reassure you. It will show up. So you will know. If there's extra fat, it will show up on the mirror. So that's how you know. And really, we want to address that because it's not an aesthetic problem. It really is a health problem. We need to address the excess fat in the body if at all possible, because it has pretty severe metabolic consequences if we don't. There's extra fat stored in the body that will cause some problems down the line if we don't address it. Hopefully, if you're eating healthy and doing exercise, you will probably be somewhat fit. But even though that's the case, there could still be some risks associated with extra fat in the body. So if we could address that, that would be beneficial to our health. Whoops. Okay, let's go back. Let's go to the second risk factor. And of course, this is no surprise to anybody. The rich Western Diet, high in sugar, especially high in refined sugars, refined carbohydrates. These are processed foods. Some people call them food-like products. Food-like products, because they're not really food, some of them. They're more like chemical experiments if you read the ingredients lists. A lot of fat in the diet. The American diet is about 38–40% fat, which is very high. So this amount of fat and extra calories in the diet will translate into a lot of intramyocellular lipids. In other words, these fat globules that are in our muscle cells that do not allow insulin to work properly. So extra energy, extra fat in particular, is dangerous. And lack of fiber. We'll talk about that next time we're together. It won't be next week because I have an activity, but in 2 weeks, I will talk about the diet to reverse diabetes, and I will talk about all the different aspects. And I will mention fiber and other things that are important. I'm just briefly mention it right now, that the major risk factor for diabetes, aside from, of course, being overweight, which, diet leads to overweight. So they're very much related. The third cause is also very much related, and it's lack of exercise. So if we're not using up all that extra energy we have been accumulating, then of course that extra energy will block insulin from working. It will have negative consequences, more than just preventing our sugars from going inside the cells, but also putting us at high risk for many other diseases. So there's high risk for heart attacks, cancers of many types, strokes, and all the other, autoimmune diseases, and all kinds of diseases that come from not utilizing our muscles and all that energy we have accumulated. Now, let me talk about this one. This is very important. People tell me all the time, especially when I'm doing presentations in person in the church. People will come up to me at the end and go, "Well, you know what? My diabetes, though, is genetic. I inherited my diabetes because my mom, my dad, my uncles, my grandparents, and all my cousins are diabetic. So mine is, inherited. It's the genetic diabetes." Well, okay. There is some element of truth there, because the predisposition to diabetes is indeed inherited. If you have close relatives, your parents, your children, your brothers or sisters, your siblings that have diabetes, you are probably predisposed to diabetes. There's some genetic component, but it's been found that it's a very small percentage of your risk. Maybe 10 to 15% of your risk comes from genes. More important than genes, than the DNA, is your lifestyle, because genes can be expressed or not expressed, and that is determined by your lifestyle. This is what we call epigenetics, if you want to look it up later. And it basically, the point is that genes can be activated or inactivated depending on our lifestyle. Lifestyle is the bigger contributor to our risk. About 60 to 80% of the risk comes from our lifestyle as opposed to our genes. So our genes, yes, they put us at a higher risk, which means we have to be maybe even more careful than people who have good genes. But that does not determine whether you will develop type 2 diabetes or not. Something very related to genetics is ethnic origins. Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians, and people from indigenous populations are at a very high risk of developing diabetes. In fact, when I worked Salud para la Gente, I worked with some indigenous populations from Mexico, from Oaxaca. And some of these young people came to the United States as teenagers. And in a matter of just a year or two, sometimes they develop diabetes by being here. Being here means they're not living off of the land anymore. They're going to Costco to buy their food. They're buying high calorie foods, processed foods. They might not be exercising as much because now they have cars, buses, all kinds of different ways to transport themselves as opposed to just walking like they might have done in the village in Mexico. So now this just very dramatic change in their lifestyle can produce diabetes in just a couple of years. And I saw it with my own eyes. So I could tell you this is true. There is an element of truth in the sense that some ethnic groups do have higher risk. But again, the risk is small in comparison to lifestyle. So lifestyle is the bigger contributor. Let me illustrate that by mentioning the one ethnic group in the United States that has the highest rate of diabetes in the whole country. Do you know which group I'm talking about? The highest rate, the ethnic group with the highest rate of diabetes in the country. Here it is, Pima Indians. They live usually in the, Southwest, Arizona, that area. They have the highest rates of diagnosed diabetes in the country. But it just so happens that the Pima Indian group has a history. And the history is this. There was a larger group a few hundred years ago that split. Some of them settled in, the Southwest of the United States. Some of them went down south and settled in northern Mexico. And these two groups are very genetically similar. They're almost cousins, if you could say it that way. They're genetically almost identical. And yet they have very different lifestyles. So the group that settled in northern Mexico, the name of this indigenous group is Tarahumaras. Tarahumaras. They're very famous because they're great runners. They run long distance marathons, 100-mile races, and they come usually in the top 10, even though they don't even use Nike shoes. Sometimes, as you can see in the picture, they just use sandals. The women compete too. They're excellent runners. They have very good physical shape. And what do you think they eat? They're actually very poor. They have low economic means. They eat a lot of traditional foods, beans, corn. They grow their own vegetables. They eat chia seeds quite a bit. And they just don't have access to a lot of the processed foods that are unfortunately available to their cousins in the north, the Pima Indians. The Pima Indians have the highest rate of diabetes in the United States. Tarahumaras have one of the lowest rates of diabetes in the world. So, do genes play a part? Yes, but it's not the determining factor. They play a small part, and it's not the most important aspect. It's not the most important determining factor. Lifestyle, diet in particular, is the most important factor. All right. So let's go back to diabetes. What does diabetes do? It ages your body. It ages your body. All that extra glucose is causing all kinds of damage in all kinds of tissues. As you probably know, it increases your risk for heart attack. As we mentioned, 50% higher risk with prediabetes, up to 400% higher risk of a heart attack once you have diabetes. And it also increases your risk for stroke, as I mentioned before. And in fact, more than 70% of diabetics die of one of these two causes, either stroke or heart attack. So, that's very important to keep in mind. Unfortunately, the diabetes treatments do not address the root cause. Most mainstream diabetes treatments have not being updated yet with all this new information. So still, unfortunately, in the medical community, most diabetes treatment is focused on the symptom, which is the high blood glucose. So the main purpose of diabetes treatment is to bring down the blood glucose, but it does not necessarily address the underlying process, which is the insulin resistance. Now, unfortunately, diabetes treatment, as conventional diabetes treatment, does not necessarily prevent complications of diabetes because, as I said, it does not go to the root cause. Instead, it just tries to, cover the symptom, and the underlying disease is still present. Therefore, we still see high levels of complications such as renal failure. Number one cause of dialysis in the country is because of diabetes that causes renal failure. The other unfortunate problem and complication is vision problems and blindness. And one of the main causes of blindness in adulthood is because of the damage in the retina caused by diabetes. The other problem is amputations because of a weakened immune system, which leads to more infections. Several years ago, we had at the Watsonville Adventist Church, I don't know if you remember, Tricia, but we had a guest from the Spanish church who gave his testimony of how he was at the Watsonville Hospital for a month, and he had severe infection in his foot. And the doctors were planning to amputate the whole foot, maybe up to the knee. And the wife called me up, desperate for help. And I gave her a copy of my Spanish book for how to reverse diabetes. And I was actually on I was, scheduled to go on a trip. And I hadn't even published this book. It was a manuscript. I printed my manuscript and gave it to her. And she read it and she started, learning from other sources as well how to reverse diabetes. And they begged the doctor to please give them more time and do not amputate. And the doctor said, well, you know what? I need to take out one toe, a little bit of the skin above the foot because it just had so much gangrene. It had to be removed. And he said, I'll give you a few months, 2 months. I don't remember exactly. I think it was 2 months. I'll give you a couple of months to stabilize. And then we'll make a decision whether we amputate the foot or up to the knee. So that was the decision-making process for the doctor. The decision was going to be amputate just the foot or up to the knee. Well, they went, eventually he went home. They were able to control the infection enough that he can go home, but he needed to go back every week because they needed to have, their wound cleaned where the amputation of the toe and some of the skin graft had been done. So that needed to be cleaned up every week. And, the wife started changing his diet. He could not walk. He could not exercise at all. He could not put his foot down on the ground, but he could eat and he could change his eating, and he did. And as they were going every week to the nurses to clean the wound, the nurses started noticing something they hadn't seen very much, and they started asking, what are you doing? And they're like, why? Well, your wound is really improving quite a bit more than what we expected. It's really healing very nicely. Just keep doing what you're doing, I guess. And so they kept going every week for the wound cleaning and everything. Well, the time came for an appointment with the doctor 2 weeks before the amputation date that they had set. So 2 weeks before the amputation, the doctor was going to evaluate whether she was going to amputate just the foot or up to the knee. And so they went to the doctor's office. The doctor took out the bandage and looked at the foot. And she's like, what have you been doing? And they're like, she kind of explained, the wife, because he's a very quiet man, she explained, oh, we've been eating and changing our food and blah, blah, blah. And the doctor was just impressed. And she was like, I don't think I need to amputate anymore. I think we're going to have to cancel the amputation. There's no need for the amputation. It seems like the infection is actually gone. And I think you're going to heal. So I don't know if you remember, Tricia, but they gave this testimony. In fact, they were crying because it was just such a beautiful testimony of healing for someone who had been, almost at the edge, right, of an amputation, but was able to reverse the condition that was causing that weakened immune system and infection to happen. So again, just to recap, to control and reverse diabetes, we need to reverse the underlying condition, which is the insulin resistance. And of course, there's programs that have been doing it for decades. New Start, in particular, this is at Weimar Institute right here in California, up in, north of Sacramento that way, or east of Sacramento. They've been doing this for about 3 decades or more, and they have hundreds, if not thousands, of success stories of people who have reversed diabetes through lifestyle intervention. There's books you can buy. You don't have to pay thousands of dollars to stay 18 days at Weimar Institute to do the New Start program, which is actually great. I think it's great if you can afford it, but not everybody can afford it, but you can probably read a book and it's $15, $20 on Amazon. You can buy Dr. Neil Barnard's program for reversing diabetes. Highly recommended. Dr. Barnard has done some research himself on reversing diabetes. There's some of that in there. There's this great book. I really like it. I remember reading it a few years ago, The 30-Day Diabetes Miracle. Excellent source of information based on the same principles of addressing the root cause of diabetes. My personal favorite is The End of Diabetes by Dr. Joe Furman. He's just a great medical doctor, a great writer, a great presenter. If you're able to ever see him in person, he just explains everything very easy and very compellingly. So that's one that I absolutely recommend. It's very easy read, very good read. If you really like reading, that's a good one. Okay, next session, we will talk about the reversal diet. So that will be in 2 weeks from today. Just wanted to let you know that's coming. It's the most important part of the program. Other parts are important too, but that is very, very important. I want to leave you with my website, healthfortoday.net. In case you want to go in there, there's some recipes. I do have a little cookbook that I do sell on Amazon. In case you want to know about that, you can go through the website.